1. Emily Long, the Broken Home Slayer. December 14th, 2025, started like any other Sunday morning in their modest two-story home. 8-year-old Mason was building with his Legos in the living room. 6-year-old Sophia was coloring at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out in concentration as she tried to stay inside the lines. 4-year-old Owen was napping upstairs, his small chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm that only children possess. David was reading the newspaper, occasionally looking up to smile at his family, unaware that his wife was studying each of them with a cold assessment of someone pricing livestock at auction. Emily had been planning this for months, not because she hated her family, but because she had simply grown tired of them. The constant needs, the endless questions, the financial drain of feeding, clothing, and housing for other people when she could live so much more comfortably alone. She had done the math repeatedly, calculating insurance payouts, mortgage payments, the cost of maintaining appearances versus the freedom of starting fresh somewhere else with a new identity and a substantial bank account. She waited until David was absorbed in the sports section before walking to the garage, where she had hidden the gun she'd purchased 3 weeks earlier. No dramatic confrontation, no tears or explanations, just a mechanical execution of a plan she had rehearsed in her mind dozens of times. She returned to the living room where her family sat in their Sunday morning bubble of contentment and open fire. Mason looked up from his Legos when he heard the first shot. His father had fallen forward onto the newspaper, red spreading across the headlines like spilled paint. The 8-year-old had just enough time to process what he was seeing before Emily turned the gun on him. His small body crumpled next to his plastic blocks, the bright colors now mixing with darker stains. Sophia heard the noise in the kitchen and came running, her coloring book still in her hand. She found her mother standing over Mason and David, the gun hanging at Emily's side like a natural extension of her arm. The 6-year-old opened her mouth to scream, but Emily silenced her before any sound could escape. The coloring book flooded the floor, its pages of careful artwork now forgotten. Upstairs, 4-year-old Owen never woke up. Emily climbed the steps slowly, almost reluctantly, but not from remorse. This was simply the most distasteful part of her plan, requiring her to approach the nursery where her youngest child slept in complete trust. She stood over his crib for a moment, watching his peaceful face, before completing her task with the same businesslike efficiency she had shown downstairs. With her family dead around her, Emily calmly called 911, reporting a home invasion. She had prepared the story as carefully as she had prepared the murders themselves, complete with self-inflicted wounds that would support her version of events. When police arrived, they found her in the front yard, bleeding from cuts on her arms and sobbing about the masked intruders who had killed her family while she hid in the closet. The performance was flawless, but the evidence wasn't. Investigators found inconsistencies in her story within hours, forensic evidence that contradicted her timeline, and financial records that revealed her growing resentment toward the cost of supporting her family. The insurance policy she'd taken out on all 4 victims just 6 months earlier painted a clear picture for meditation that no amount of fake tears could wash away. During interrogation, Emily's mask finally slipped. When confronted with the physical evidence that demolished her home invasion story, she didn't break down in remorse or claim temporary insanity. Instead, she calmly explained her reasoning as if discussing a business decision. The children had become too expensive. David's construction income wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle she wanted. The insurance money would allow her to start over somewhere warm, maybe Florida or California, without the burden of supporting people who contributed nothing to her happiness. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting evidence of Emily's months of planning, her internet searches for information about staging crime scenes, and her purchase of the murder weapon under a false name. The defense tried to argue postpartum depression from Owen's birth 4 years earlier, but the jury saw through this desperate attempt to explain away murder with medical terminology. On August 3rd, 2025, Emily Long was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to death by lethal injection, making her the first woman in New Hampshire history to receive capital punishment for familicide. She was 32 years old when she heard her sentence, and she received the news with the same emotional detachment she had shown while planning her family's destruction. Emily now sits in her cell at the New Hampshire State Prison for Women, where she spends her days reading romance novels and writing letters to pen pals who find her story fascinating rather than revolting. Her appeals continue through the court system, but the evidence against her remains overwhelming. Her conviction unshakable, her sentence a reflection of the community's horror at what she did to the people who trusted her most. 2. Sarah Jean Hartsfield, the serial widow. In the quiet suburbs of Katy, Texas, Sarah Jean Hartsfield had perfected the art of widowhood. Twice married, twice widowed, both husbands dead before their 40th birthdays from sudden, mysterious illnesses that doctors struggled to explain. To neighbors, she seemed like the unluckiest woman in America, cursed to watch the men she loved waste away despite her devoted nursing care. But luck, as detectives would discover, had nothing to do with it. Sarah's first husband, Titus Child, died in January 2018 after a rapid decline that puzzled medical professionals. He had been healthy, athletic, working as a corrections officer when he suddenly began experiencing severe digestive problems, muscle weakness, and organ failure that progressed far too quickly for any natural disease process. Sarah was at his bedside throughout his final weeks, feeding him soup with her own hands, administering his medications with the precision of a trained nurse, and documenting his symptoms with the thoroughness of someone building a medical record. The death certificate listed acute organ failure as the cause, but nobody thought to test for poison. Why would they? Sarah was a grieving widow, collecting life insurance money that would help her rebuild her shattered life. She played the role perfectly, wearing black to the funeral, crying at appropriate moments, and speaking about Titus with the kind of love that convinced everyone she had lost her soulmate. But Sarah didn't grieve for long. Within 6 months, she had met David Bragg, a successful engineer who was charmed by her strength in overcoming such tragedy. David saw Sarah's widowhood as proof of her capacity for deep love, evidence that she knew how to commit to marriage through good times and bad. He proposed after a whirlwind courtship, eager to give this wounded woman the happiness she deserved. Their marriage began beautifully, with David treating Sarah like a precious treasure that needed protection from further heartbreak. He bought her gifts, took her on expensive vacations, and increased his life insurance policy to ensure she would be financially secure if anything ever happened to him. It was this last gesture of love that would ultimately cost him everything. David's health problems started about 18 months into their marriage, beginning with the same mysterious digestive issues that had plagued Titus. Sarah was immediately attentive, cooking special meals to help settle his stomach, researching his symptoms online, and scheduling doctor appointments to get to the bottom of his condition. To everyone who knew them, she appeared to be the perfect wife, determined not to lose another husband to unexplained illness. But David's condition worsened despite Sarah's care, or perhaps because of it. He began experiencing muscle spasms, difficulty breathing, and episodes where his heart would race uncontrollably. Each time he improved slightly, he would have another setback, usually after eating something Sarah had prepared especially for him. The pattern was subtle enough that nobody noticed at first, including David himself. The breakthrough came when David, growing suspicious of his wife's ministrations, secretly recorded her preparing his medication one evening. The footage showed Sarah adding something to his pills from a small vial she kept hidden in her purse. When he confronted her about it, she claimed it was a natural supplement to boost his immune system, but David had been married to her long enough to recognize the look in her eyes when she lied. Instead of drinking the doctor medication, David poured it down the sink and called poison control the next morning. Tests revealed that the liquid contained insulin in concentrations that would have been fatal to a non-diabetic person. Further investigation of Sarah's belongings uncovered vials of insulin digitalis and other substances that had no legitimate purpose in their household. The police investigation expanded to include Titus's death. An exhumation of his body revealed high levels of insulin and other toxins that had been missed during the original autopsy. Sarah had been systematically poisoning both husbands, administering doses carefully calculated to mimic natural disease progression while ensuring their deaths would appear medical rather than criminal. During questioning, Sarah maintained her innocence with the same tearful performance that had convinced 2 sets of doctors, countless neighbors, and David himself that she was a devoted wife watching her husband die from natural causes. She claimed the substances found in her possession were for her own medical conditions, that she had never poisoned anyone, that she was being framed by someone who wanted to destroy her life. But the evidence spoke louder than her protests. Phone records showed her researching lethal doses of various substances. Financial records revealed her mounting debts and substantial insurance payouts she had collected from Titus's death. Most damning of all, David's secret recording captured her in the act of preparing the poison that would have killed him if he hadn't grown suspicious. The trial revealed the full scope of Sarah's poisoning campaign. Medical experts testified about the specific effects of the substances she had used, explaining how she had administered them in doses designed to cause maximum suffering while appearing accidental. Insurance investigators documented her pattern of taking out policies on her husbands shortly before their health began declining. Sarah's defense team argued that she was a victim of circumstance, that losing two husbands to natural causes had made her paranoid about David's health, leading her to administer what she believed were helpful supplements. But the jury saw through these explanations to the calculating mind underneath, someone who had turned marriage into a business venture with murder as the exit strategy. On March 15, 2024, Sarah Jean Hartsfield was convicted on 2 counts of capital murder for killing her husbands with poison. The judge sentenced her to death by lethal injection, noting particular cruelty of her method and the betrayal of trust inherent in her crimes. She was 48 years old when she received her death sentence, joining the small population of women awaiting execution in Texas. 3. Monica Sementilli, the Black Widow of Beverly Hills. Some women kill with their own hands, driven by passion or desperation to commit acts they never imagined possible. Others prefer distance, hiring professionals to handle the messy business of murder while they maintain plausible deniability miles away. Monica Sementilli belonged to the second category, a woman who ordered her husband's death like a business transaction and then acted surprised when detectives came to collect payment in the form of a life sentence. Monica's marriage to Fabio Sementilli had been deteriorating for years by the time she decided murder was preferable to divorce. Fabio was a successful hairstylist to Hollywood celebrities, building a salon empire that generated millions of dollars annually, while Monica spent those millions on shopping trips, luxury vacations, and investments that consistently lost money. Their Beverly Hills lifestyle looked perfect on the outside, but behind their mansion's gates, arguments about money had become daily warfare. Divorce would have cost Monica half of everything, plus ongoing alimony payments that would force her to maintain some semblance of financial responsibility. But widowhood offered a different equation entirely. As Fabio's sole beneficiary, she would inherit his entire fortune without having to justify her spending to divorce attorneys or family court judges. The only obstacle was convincing someone else to do the killing while she established an alibi elsewhere. Monica found her solution through connections in Los Angeles' criminal underworld, people who knew people who handled problems that couldn't be resolved through legal channels. She didn't want to know details about method or timing, only that her husband would die in a way that appeared random, unconnected to their marital problems or her financial motivations. She was willing to pay handsomely for this service, treating murder like any other luxury purchase that wealthy people make when they want something handled professionally. The contract was arranged through intermediaries, with Monica never meeting the actual killers face-to-face. She paid an initial deposit of $50,000, with another $100,000 promised upon completion of the job. The money came from a secret account she had been funding for months, skimming cash from Fabio's business operations in amounts small enough to avoid detection, but large enough to accumulate into murder money. On January 23rd, 2017, while Monica was attending a charity gala in Santa Monica with dozens of witnesses, 2 men broke into the Sementilli home in Woodland Hills. They found Fabio in his study, working on business accounts for his chain of salons, completely unaware that his wife had purchased his death. The attack was swift and professional, designed to look like a robbery gone wrong rather than a planned assassination. The killers beat Fabio with blunt instruments, inflicting injuries severe enough to cause death, but consistent with a burglary where the homeowner had surprised intruders. They ransacked the house, taking jewelry and electronics to support the robbery narrative, but left behind far more valuable items that professional thieves would never have overlooked. These inconsistencies would later help investigators distinguish between genuine theft and staged crime scenes. Monica's performance at the crime scene was flawless, arriving home to find police cars and ambulances surrounding her house, playing the shocked wife perfectly. She collapsed dramatically upon learning of Fabio's death, required medical attention for what appeared to be genuine grief, and cooperated fully with detectives who initially treated her as a victim rather than a suspect. But homicide investigators noticed details that didn't align with Monica's story. The timing of her husband's murder, occurring precisely when she had an ironclad alibi, seemed remarkably coincidental. The robbery appeared staged, with valuable items left behind, while less expensive items were stolen. Most suspicious of all, Monica seemed more concerned about accessing Fabio's bank accounts than identifying his killers. The financial investigation revealed Monica's secret account and the large cash withdrawals she had made in the weeks before Fabio's murder. Phone records showed her communicating with known criminals. Conversations she claimed were about hiring security for their home, but which took on different meaning in light of her husband's death. When police arrested the actual killers months later, they provided detailed testimony about Monica's role in planning and financing the assassination. The trial exposed Monica's transformation from pampered socialite to calculating murderer. Prosecutors presented evidence of her mounting debts, her resentment over Fabio's attempts to control her spending, and her cold-blooded decision that widowhood was more profitable than divorce. The jury heard recordings of her discussing the murder plot, financial records documenting her payments to the killers, and testimony from the criminals she had hired to commit the actual violence. Monica's defense team argued that she was being framed by the real killers, that her wealth and lifestyle made her a convenient scapegoat for a robbery that had gone tragically wrong. They painted her as a grieving widow whose suspicious behavior resulted from shock and grief rather than guilt. But the evidence of her premeditation was overwhelming, her financial motive clear, her involvement in the murder conspiracy undeniable. On September 12, 2019, Monica Sementilli was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that she had betrayed not only her husband's trust, but the institution of marriage itself by turning their home into a crime scene. She was 54 years old when she received her sentence, trading her Beverly Hills mansion for a cell in the Central California Women's Facility. Monica now spends her days in Chowchilla, where her designer clothes have been replaced with prison uniforms and her luxury lifestyle has been reduced to the basic necessities provided by the state. Her appeals continue to the court system, but the evidence of her guilt remains solid, her conviction secure, her sentence a reflection of society's judgment on women who hire killers to solve their marital problems. For Jennifer Gledhill, the conspiracy widow, marriage counselors often tell couples that communication is the key to resolving conflict, that talking through problems can prevent relationships from reaching the breaking point. But some people prefer more direct methods of ending disagreements, and Jennifer Gledhill had decided that the most effective way to win an argument with her husband was to make sure he could never argue back. Jennifer and Matthew Gledhill lived in Cottonwood Heights, Utah, where they presented themselves as a devoted Mormon couple raising their 3 children according to church teachings about family values and eternal commitment. Matthew worked as a software engineer, providing the stable income that supported their comfortable suburban lifestyle, while Jennifer focused on home management and their children's activities. To neighbors and fellow church members, they seemed like the ideal family, proof that traditional marriage could thrive in modern America. But behind their front door, the Gledhill marriage was disintegrating under the weight of financial stress, parenting disagreements, and Jennifer's growing resentment toward her husband's attempts to control household spending. Matthew had become increasingly concerned about their debt levels, questioning Jennifer's purchases and suggesting they needed to live more modestly until their financial situation improved. These conversations had evolved from discussions to arguments to threats that Jennifer interpreted as attacks on her autonomy. The breaking point came when Matthew discovered that Jennifer had been hiding credit card debt and making major purchases without his knowledge. He threatened to take control of all their accounts, to monitor her spending more closely, and to involve a financial advisor in restructuring their budget. For Jennifer, this represented an unacceptable level of oversight, a reduction in her status from equal partner to supervised dependent, rather than negotiate a compromise or seek marriage counseling. Jennifer chose a solution that would eliminate both her husband and her financial problems in one decisive action. She began planning Matthew's death with the same attention to detail she had previously devoted to organizing church events and school fundraisers, treating murder as another project that required careful coordination and flawless execution. Jennifer enlisted her parents in conspiracy, though she presented Matthew's death as necessary rather than elective. She told them that her husband had been abusive, that she feared for her safety and the safety of their children, that killing him was the only way to protect her family from escalating violence. Her parents, believing their daughter's story about domestic abuse, agreed to help dispose of evidence and provide alibis. On September 13, 2020, Jennifer waited until Matthew fell asleep in their marital bed, the same bed where they had conceived their children and shared intimate moments during happier times in their relationship. She retrieved the gun she had hidden in their bedroom closet and placed it against her sleeping husband's head. Matthew never woke up, never had a chance to defend himself or understand why his wife of 12 years had decided that death was preferable to divorce. After shooting Matthew, Jennifer called her parents, who arrived within hours to help clean up the crime scene and dispose of her husband's body. They wrapped him in plastic sheeting, loaded him into a truck, and drove to a remote area where they buried him in a shallow grave. Jennifer then began crafting the story she would tell police, friends, and family members about her husband's sudden disappearance. Jennifer reported Matthew missing 3 days later, claiming he had left for work as usual but never arrived at his office. She played the worried wife convincingly, organizing search parties, appealing to media outlets, and begging anyone with information to come forward. Her performance was so persuasive that hundreds of volunteers spent weeks searching for a man who was already buried in the desert. The investigation began to focus on Jennifer when inconsistencies emerged in her timeline of Matthew's disappearance. Cell phone records showed her device moving to locations she couldn't explain. Financial records revealed her immediate efforts to access her husband's life insurance policy, and surveillance footage captured her parents' truck traveling to and from the area where Matthew's body was later discovered. When police arrested Jennifer 6 months after Matthew's disappearance, she maintained that her husband had simply walked away from their marriage, abandoning his family for reasons she couldn't understand. But when investigators found his grave and recovered his remains, the evidence of murder became impossible to deny. Ballistics tests matched the bullet in Matthew's skull to the gun found hidden in Jennifer's bedroom. The trial revealed a family conspiracy that had enabled Matthew's murder and concealment. Prosecutors presented evidence of Jennifer's planning, her parents' assistance in disposing of the body, and her elaborate deception in reporting her husband missing. The jury heard testimony about the couple's financial problems, Jennifer's resentment over Matthew's attempts to control spending, and her decision that widowhood was preferable to working through marital difficulties. Jennifer's defense team argued that she had been a victim of domestic violence, that Matthew's financial control represented psychological abuse that had driven her to desperate measures. They painted the killing as self-defense rather than premeditated murder, claiming that Jennifer had feared for her life when she pulled the trigger. But investigators found no evidence of physical abuse, no medical records documenting injuries, no history of domestic violence calls to their address. On November 8, 2022, Jennifer Gledhill was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Her parents received shorter sentences for their roles in helping conceal the crime. Jennifer was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to turn family disagreements into homicide cases. Jennifer now sits in a Utah State prison, where she continues to claim that killing Matthew was justified by abuse that existed only in her imagination. Her children have been placed with relatives who are trying to help them understand how their mother could have murdered their father and then lied about it for months while pretending to search for him. 5. Cheryl Howell Coe, the open marriage murderess. When marriage counselors talk about opening up relationships, they mean honest communication about desires and boundaries. When Cheryl Howell Coe heard her husband mention the possibility of inviting others into their marriage, she heard something entirely different. She heard a declaration of war. The suburbs of Gwinnett County, Georgia, had seen their share of domestic disputes, but nothing quite like what was brewing inside the Coe household in the summer of 2021. Neighbors knew James Coe as a quiet man who worked nights at the warehouse and kept his lawn immaculate. They knew Cheryl as the wife who smiled too wide at block parties and asked too many questions about other people's marriages. What they didn't know was that behind their vinyl siding and manicured hedges, a conversation about marital boundaries had turned into a death sentence. James had approached the topic delicately, the way someone might suggest trying a new restaurant or taking a different route to work. He talked about couples therapy articles he'd read, about communication, and exploring new dimensions of their relationship. For James, this was about strengthening their bond, about addressing the distance that had grown between them over 15 years of marriage. For Cheryl, this was about replacement, about being discarded for someone younger, more adventurous, more willing to share. The argument that followed wasn't the kind married couples have and then laugh about years later. It was a kind that reveals fundamental incompatibilities, the kind that makes you realize you've been living with a stranger. James tried to explain that suggesting openness wasn't about finding someone else. It was about finding each other again. But Cheryl had already decided that any marriage involving other people was no marriage at all, and any husband who would suggest such a thing was no husband worth keeping. She spent 3 weeks planning James's death, researching methods and opportunities with the same thoroughness she had once devoted to planning their anniversary dinners. Cheryl wasn't interested in poison or staged accidents. She wanted something immediate, something that would let James know exactly who was ending his life and why. She wanted him to understand that this was what happened to men who thought their wives were replaceable. On September 14th, 2021, Cheryl waited until James returned from his warehouse shift, tired and unsuspecting, still hoping their marriage could be saved through conversation and compromise. She had prepared dinner, set the table with their wedding china, and placed his favorite beer next to his plate. To James, this looked like reconciliation, like his wife's way of saying they could work through their problems. To Cheryl, this was a last meal. As James sat down to eat, Cheryl retrieved the kitchen knife she had sharpened that afternoon and plunged it into his back, just below the shoulder blade, angled upward toward his heart. James spun around in his chair, shock and pain replacing the relief he had felt moments earlier. He tried to understand why his wife was holding a bloody knife, tried to ask what was happening, but Cheryl wasn't interested in explanations. She stabbed him again, this time in the chest, puncturing his lung and sending him stumbling backward against the kitchen counter. James gasped for breath that wouldn't come, clutching at wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, looking at his wife with confusion of someone who had fundamentally misunderstood the person he married. Cheryl watched him struggle for several minutes before delivering the final wound that ended his life on their kitchen floor. After James died, Cheryl called 911 with a story about a home invasion, about mass intruders who had attacked them both during what was supposed to be a quiet dinner home. She inflicted superficial cuts on her own arms to support her version of events, messed up a house to suggest a struggle, and practiced her grief-stricken widow performance while waiting for police to arrive. The investigation began as a routine home invasion case, with detectives initially treating Cheryl as a victim who had survived a random attack that claimed her husband's life. But forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed inconsistencies that didn't match her story. The blood spatter pattern suggested James had been stabbed while seated, not during a struggle with multiple attackers. The wounds were precise and personal, not the kind inflicted during a chaotic burglary. Most damning of all, investigators found Cheryl's internet search history, which revealed weeks of research into fatal stabbing techniques, insurance policy details, and methods for staging home invasions. Her phone records showed calls to divorce attorneys, suggesting she had been considering legal separation before deciding on a more permanent solution. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence of the couple's marital problems, Cheryl's mounting resentment over James's suggestions about their relationship, and her deliberate planning of his murder. They showed that this wasn't a crime of passion during a heated argument, but a calculated execution disguised as a random attack. On March 8th, 2025, Cheryl Howell Coe was convicted of malice murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 47 years old when she received her sentence, trading her suburban home for a prison cell because she preferred killing her husband to sharing him. 6. Ashley Benefield, the Black Swan. The stage lights had once illuminated Ashley's every movement as she pirouetted across polished floors, commanding audiences with a grace that only years of discipline can create. But by September 27, 2020, The only audience watching Ashley Benefield was a jury trying to determine whether the former ballerina was a victim defending herself or a manipulator who had choreographed a perfect murder. Ballet taught Ashley that timing was everything, that the smallest adjustment in positioning could mean the difference between triumph and catastrophe. These lessons served her well during her tumultuous marriage to Doug Benefield, a relationship that began like a fairy tale and ended with gunshots in a suburban driveway. The question that haunted everyone who knew them was whether Ashley's final performance was self-defense or the culmination of a deadly dance she had been orchestrating for months. Ashley met Doug in 2016 at a political event in Charleston, where the 24-year-old former ballerina was immediately drawn to the charismatic businessman who was nearly 30 years her senior. Doug had wealth, connections, and the kind of confidence that comes from decades of getting what you want. Ashley had youth, beauty, and dreams of building something meaningful beyond the dance studio. Their whirlwind romance felt like destiny to both of them. They married within months of meeting, a decision that shocked Ashley's family and friends, but seemed perfectly natural to the couple themselves. Doug lavished gifts and attention on his young bride, while Ashley threw herself into the role of devoted wife with the same intensity she had once brought to perfecting her grand jetés. For a brief, shining moment, their age difference seemed irrelevant, their connection transcendent. But fairy tales have a way of revealing themselves as cautionary tales when the honeymoon phase ends. Doug's generosity began to feel like control, his protectiveness like possession. He monitored Ashley's communications, questioned her friendships, and made decisions about their life together without consulting her. For Ashley, accustomed to the rigid structure of ballet but also to being the star of her own performance, this felt like being demoted to background dancer in her own life. The marriage deteriorated rapidly after Ashley became pregnant with their daughter. Doug's controlling behavior intensified, while Ashley's desire for independence grew stronger. She began documenting instances of what she claimed was domestic abuse, taking photographs of bruises, and keeping detailed records of their arguments. Doug's family and friends saw these claims as manipulation, an attempt by a young wife to gain leverage in what they predicted would be an expensive divorce. When Ashley moved to Maryland with her infant daughter, ostensibly for a fresh start, but effectively to put distance between Doug and his child, the custody battle began in earnest. Doug filed for joint custody, claiming Ashley was alienating him from their daughter and making false abuse allegations. Ashley countered with restraining orders and sworn statements about Doug's threatening behavior. The final confrontation came when Doug traveled to Maryland to collect belongings from the home Ashley was renting. According to Ashley's testimony, Doug became aggressive and threatening during the encounter, forcing her to retreat to her bedroom where she retrieved a pistol she had purchased for protection. She claimed Doug continued to advance on her despite her warnings, leaving her no choice but to fire. Doug Benefield died from gunshot wounds in Ashley's driveway, with their toddler daughter inside the house during the shooting. Ashley immediately called 911, sobbing as she explained that she had shot her husband in self-defense during what she described as a violent confrontation. But investigators found inconsistencies in her account that raised questions about whether the shooting was truly defensive. The physical evidence suggested Doug had been shot while moving away from Ashley, not toward her as she claimed. Witnesses reported hearing Ashley on the phone with someone during the incident, potentially coordinating her response. Most troubling of all, investigators discovered Ashley had been researching Florida's Stand Your Ground laws in the weeks before the shooting. During the trial, Ashley's defense team painted her as a victim of domestic violence who had been forced to defend herself against an abusive husband with a history of controlling behavior. They presented evidence of Doug's attempt to monitor and control Ashley's activities, his threats regarding custody of their daughter, and his pattern of intimidating behavior. The prosecution argued that Ashley had manipulated the situation to create justification for killing Doug, that she had lured him to Maryland and engineered a confrontation that would allow her to claim self-defense. They suggested that Ashley, facing a custody battle she might lose, had decided that widowhood was preferable to sharing their daughter with Doug. On July 23, 2024, after deliberating for several hours, the jury found Ashley Benefield guilty of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, suggesting they believed some element of her self-defense claim while rejecting her version of events entirely. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a compromise verdict that reflected the complexity of a case involving domestic violence allegations, child custody disputes, and a dead husband who could no longer defend himself against his wife's claims. 7. Maureen Rickards, the Garden Grave Widow. Some women spend decades learning to flinch at the sound of footsteps on the stairs, to calculate the safest time to speak, to measure their words by the weight of the bruises they might earn. Maureen Rickards had graduated from that terrible curriculum with honors, having survived 23 years of marriage to a man who used her body as his personal stress relief and her spirit as his punching bag. But survival, as Maureen discovered in the winter of 2025, sometimes requires crossing lines that can never be uncrossed. The cottage in rural Cornwall had been their prison together for more than 2 decades, far enough from neighbors that screams wouldn't carry and isolated enough that authorities rarely visited. Simon Rickards had chosen the location deliberately, the same way he had chosen everything else in their marriage, to maximize his control and minimize her options. What he hadn't considered was that isolation could work both ways, that the same remoteness that hid his abuse could also hide his disappearance. Maureen's transformation from victim to killer didn't happen overnight. It was a result of years of accumulating rage, of watching her children grow up afraid of their father, of realizing that the police visits and counselor sessions and temporary restraining orders were just intermissions in a play that would only end one way. Simon had made it clear that divorce wasn't an option, that running wasn't possible, that the only way Maureen would leave her marriage was in a coffin. He was right about that, just wrong about whose coffin it would be. The night Simon died, he had been drinking more heavily than usual, celebrating what he called Maureen's attitude adjustment after their latest fight. She had suggested, tentatively, that maybe they should seek counseling, that their marriage was affecting the children's happiness and development. Simon's response had been swift and violent, leaving Maureen with a split lip and a familiar ache in her ribs that meant he'd been careful to hit where the bruises wouldn't show. As Simon passed out in his recliner, empty bottles scattered around his feet, like offerings to his own rage, Maureen made a decision that had been building in her mind for months. She retrieved a carving knife from the kitchen, the one Simon had used to threaten her during their worst fights, and approached his sleeping form with the steady hands of someone who had finally stopped shaking. She killed him while he slept, sliding the blade between his ribs with the precision of someone who had spent years studying her husband's anatomy, learning which injuries healed quickly and which ones didn't. Simon died without waking, without knowing that his victim had finally become his executioner, without understanding that his wife had decided she preferred being a murderer to being a corpse. After confirming Simon was dead, Maureen began the process of erasing him from the world. She dismembered his body in their bathtub, a task that took most of the night and all of her remaining emotional reserves. She had prepared for this, purchasing plastic sheeting and industrial cleaners, studying methods of disposal with the same thoroughness she had once devoted to hiding bruises and explaining away injuries. She buried pieces of Simon throughout their property, scattering his remains across the acreage that had once been their marital home and was now his unmarked grave. Some parts went into the compost pile, others into holes she dug near the tree line. She kept no map, no record of where each piece lay. Simon had become part of the landscape that had witnessed his abuse, absorbed into the earth that had soaked up Maureen's tears and blood for over 20 years. For 6 months, Maureen lived as a widow, without technically being one. She told neighbors and family that Simon had left her, that he had packed his belongings and disappeared without explanation. The story was believable to people who knew Simon's volatile temperament and history of threatening to abandon his family whenever he felt sufficiently wronged or constrained. But Simon's employer eventually reported him missing when he failed to collect several paychecks, and his mother demanded a police investigation when her calls went unanswered for months. The investigation began as a missing person case, but shifted focus when detectives realized how eagerly Maureen was cooperating with their inquiries, how relieved she seemed that someone was finally looking for her husband. The search of their property revealed forensic evidence of Simon's murder and dismemberment. Blood evidence, despite Maureen's cleaning efforts, told a story of what had happened in their bathtub. Soil analysis revealed human remains scattered across their acreage. Most incriminating of all, Maureen's internet search history revealed months of research into body disposal, missing person investigations, and the legal requirements for declaring someone dead. During questioning, Maureen eventually confessed to killing Simon, but her confession was as much therapy session as criminal admission. She detailed decades of abuse, described the escalating violence that convinced her that Simon would eventually kill her, and explained her decision to eliminate the threat he represented to herself and her children. The trial became a complex examination of domestic violence, self-defense, and the point at which victims become perpetrators. Maureen's defense team presented extensive evidence of Simon's abuse, medical records documenting injuries, and testimony from neighbors who had witnessed his violence. They argued that Maureen had acted in self-defense, that her premeditation was not about murder, but about survival. On October 15, 2025, Maureen Rickards was convicted of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, with the jury accepting that her actions, while illegal, were the result of prolonged abuse that had left her with no other perceived options. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, a term that acknowledged both the crime she committed and the circumstances that drove her to it. 8. Ellen Gilland, the Mercy Widow. Marriage vows include the promise to love through sickness and health, but they don't specify what happens when sickness becomes unbearable and health becomes a memory. Ellen Gilland had honored those vows for 51 years, caring for her husband Jerry through heart attacks, strokes, and the slow decline that comes with aging. But when Jerry begged her to end his suffering, Ellen faced a choice between the law and love. The morning of January 21st, 2023, brought something unprecedented to Advent Health Daytona Beach Hospital. Ellen arrived at Jerry's room, carrying more than flowers. Hidden in her bag was a gun she had brought to fulfill a promise that would transform her from devoted wife to accused murderer. Jerry was dying at 77, his body failing comprehensively. Despite medications and medical interventions, he was suffering. Jerry had made his wishes clear repeatedly. He didn't want to linger, didn't want to burden Ellen with prolonged medical care, didn't want his final chapter written in hospital rooms and morphine drips. The couple had discussed end-of-life scenario for years, as long-married people do when mortality becomes real. Jerry had always been adamant about preferring a quick exit on his own terms to a prolonged farewell orchestrated by medical professionals. When doctors could offer only palliative care, Jerry reminded Ellen of their conversations and asked her to help him die with dignity. Ellen spent sleepless nights wrestling with Jerry's request, knowing that helping him die would likely mean spending her remaining years in prison. But watching Jerry's daily struggle, seeing his dignity eroded by pain, Ellen gradually came to believe that refusing his request would be the greater betrayal of their marriage vows. On that January morning, Ellen entered Jerry's room for their final conversation. They spoke quietly about their 51 years together, their children and grandchildren, the life they had built together. Then Jerry reminded Ellen of her promise, and she retrieved the gun from her bag. Ellen shot Jerry once, ending his suffering instantly, but beginning her own nightmare. She didn't flee or attempt to cover up what she had done. Instead, she remained with Jerry's body, waiting for security and police. When they found her, she was holding Jerry's hand, crying from grief rather than regret. Ellen never posed a threat to anyone except herself. She surrendered immediately, cooperated fully, and explained that she had killed Jerry at his request because she loved him too much to watch him suffer. The charges sparked intense debate about end-of-life care, spousal devotion, and the criminalization of mercy killings. On May 27, 2025, Ellen Gilland was convicted of first-degree murder but received 25 years in prison. At 76 when sentenced, she will likely die in prison for crime of loving her husband enough to end his suffering. The neighbors in Candia, New Hampshire, thought they knew the perfect family next door. 3 children playing in the backyard, a husband who worked construction, a mother who volunteered at school events. But perfection requires maintenance, and when that maintenance becomes too expensive, some people choose elimination instead of effort. December 14, 2025, started like any other Sunday morning. 8-year-old Mason was building with Legos. 6-year-old Sophia was coloring at the kitchen table. 4-year-old Owen was napping upstairs. David was reading the newspaper, unaware that his wife Emily was studying each of them with the cold assessment of someone pricing livestock at auction. Emily had been planning this for months, not because she hated her family, but because she had grown tired of them. The constant needs, the endless questions, the financial drain of supporting for other people when she could live more comfortably alone. She had calculated insurance payouts, mortgage payments, the cost of maintaining appearances versus the freedom of starting fresh. She waited until David was absorbed in the sports section before retrieving the gun from the garage. No dramatic confrontation, no tears or explanations, just a mechanical execution of a plan she had rehearsed dozens of times. She returned to the living room and opened fire. Mason looked up from his Legos when he heard the first shot. His father had fallen forward onto the newspaper, red spreading across headlines. Emily turned the gun on him before he could process what was happening. Sophia came running from the kitchen with her coloring book, only to be silenced before any scream could escape. Upstairs, Owen never woke up. With her family dead, Emily calmly called 911, reporting a home invasion. She had prepared the story as carefully as the murders themselves, complete with self-inflicted wounds. When police arrived, they found her sobbing about masked intruders. The performance was flawless, but the evidence wasn't. Investigators found inconsistencies within hours, forensic evidence contradicting her timeline, and insurance policies taken out just 6 months earlier. During interrogation, Emily's mask slipped. She calmly explained her reasoning as if discussing business. The children had become too expensive, David's income insufficient for the lifestyle she wanted. On August 3rd, 2025, Emily Long was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, becoming New Hampshire's first woman to receive capital punishment for familicide. She was 32 and received the news with the same emotional detachment she had shown while planning her family's destruction.